All right, today I'm joined by Jennifer Ray, one of our artists whose exhibition In Range is currently in the education wing here at the Salina Art Center through January 3rd. Jennifer is going to talk a little bit about her exhibition, but first, if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your broader artistic practice.
Sure. So In Range is a project I've been working on for about 8 years, but that's also kind of overlapped with other projects and emerged from other projects as these things usually do. I would say that my broad interest is in looking at culture through the landscape. And I'm mostly interested in sort of trash, honestly. I photograph a lot of trash. And I think I've gotten really good at finding interesting things and looking for what our sort of trash can tell us and how it can be used to talk about the culture that it's coming from. And so this project, In Range, that's in the gallery, is looking, well, a little bit more about maybe how I became interested in that. I think I've always been a bit of a loner, and I always like to explore. And those things are, very much about how I grew up kind of out in the woods, and I spent a lot of time running around by myself, as a 5-year-old in the woods, because that's what people did in the 80s. And exploring the world and discovering things for myself. And I think for me that desire to kind of learn about the world through experience has really driven my photo practice. And I feel like these projects sometimes are just an excuse for me to explore the world and to look carefully at things. And I also I think I'm a classical kind of introvert. I really, all my energy comes from being alone. And so these projects are kind of always devoid of people, which, is partly sort of related to the way that I can think and the way that I can work. It's very hard for me to make work with an assistant, or even making portraits. I find pretty difficult. But also I think for me, it's become a conceptual aspect of the work. It's a way to talk about sometimes really heated and controversial issues without delving into the identity politics that generally define battle lines. And I think it makes it a lot easier to have bigger, broader conversations where people can maybe look at the work and see themselves, and without kind of exploiting anyone, without making fun of anyone. And so for me, it all kind of works out. So this project, In Range, it really began, most of my projects began because I've stumbled across something that I find interesting. And I literally drove down a interesting dirt road on a meandering road trip across the country in maybe 2009, and found a spot that looked interesting. There were lots of bullet casings. Somebody had clearly been shooting. And so I made a photograph and put a pin in my GPS, and made a mental note to come back here someday. And a few years later, I was making another road trip across the country, and I went back and explored the area more fully and realized that this is a area outside of Casper, Wyoming, and it's a bit of public state-owned land that is unregulated and or broadly unregulated, and and people, I think, can kind of do whatever they want there. And you know, outside of Casper, the thing that people want to do is shoot guns at crazy things. So that's the origin story of the project.
Great, thank you. I was going to ask about how you found that space, because it seems fascinating. And I know, like you were saying in your statement about how, yeah, these are not like places that are marked on a map. They're they're just out there.
No.
So I think that's really interesting that you're able to find that. One of the questions that I had, I think that related more again to probably some of your larger projects, because I think there was another one on your website where you reference this kind of ongoing project. And like, I think you just said this In Range has been about 8 years that you've been working on these images, which I think is really interesting. And there seems to be some kind of like temporal or almost like research aspect to your work. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So the work has really changed a lot over the time that I've been working on it. Although I think in pretty subtle ways. So in this show, the piece behind you is one of the first pieces I made for the project. You know, I think it's largely the way that I think about it has maybe become richer. When I first started the project, I mostly thought that it was, you know, I was thinking about sculpture primarily, and about how this action of shooting these objects, you know, interesting kind of objects, had sort of sculpted these objects. And so I wanted to photograph them like they were sculptures, which is initially why I started photographing primarily at night. You know, I'm basically using the night sky as a backdrop, and using studio lights. And I was interested in metaphor to begin with, but I actually had a 5-year gap in working on the project, and so returned to it for the first time in 2017. And you know, I think the political landscape had definitely shifted by that point, and these issues around sort of the cultural lines that we have drawn to sort of demarcate territory had become much more intense at that point. And so, you know, thinking about this sort of world of gun ownership and target shooting, that really seemed like a way for me to talk about some of those really deep divisions in culture. And so the work has become much more specific in that way. And I'm really thinking a lot about how do I sort of reflect back these various aspects of our culture with the work, and how do I how do I make this work relevant to people outside of the gun world? You know, because I think it's fascinating to me how different the United States is compared to virtually every other country in the world in our attitudes toward gun ownership. And I think that is really worth digging into why that is. And there's a growing body of research on that subject. And I think a lot of these really core reasons have to do with the way that our country began. And our country began in this pretty violent way that, you know, was about sort of colonialism and about sort of mastery of, you know, one group over another. And I think those issues are still really right at the, you know, just under the surface of American culture, and they have so much to do with the current situation.
Right. Thank you. One of the things you brought up in that when you were talking was the idea of metaphors. And with your work, with your installation now up here in the galleries, one of the things that I really enjoyed is going through the titles, with each piece, because I think I think there is like some hidden meaning in those. Can you talk a little bit about the titles?
Yeah, so sometimes my titles are literally just a description of the objects, but sometimes, and it pretty much is always happening while I'm making the piece, I know the title already. And so I think for me, the titles have become a way to, to really direct the viewer about what I'm thinking about when I make the piece, in ways that are maybe not always possible to do with the piece itself, and to really, clue the viewer in that this thing that I'm photographing that might look happenstance is actually not. So that's one aspect of the work, is that, sometimes people don't see it, but I'm really doing quite a lot of staging of the things that I find. I'm collecting bits and pieces of blown apart material, and thinking about how do I put them together? What things do I put next to the other piece? These are always things that are coming from the environment. It's always, somebody else's trash that I'm working with, and I'm photographing it in the place where I found it. But but the pictures are very much sort of my creations. And one of the things that I've sort of realized is that, kind of setting things up for a photograph sort of demands a lot of the same things as setting things up to shoot with a gun. And I think that's too an interesting sort of coincidence that there is the same sort of like relationship between a camera and an object and a gun and an object. But so back to metaphor, I suppose, and titling. I mean, I want people to know, what sort of point I'm trying to make. I think sometimes the titles, I think when they're good, at least, not all my titles are good, but when they are good, they are also, they can avoid being didactic and maybe also reflect some of the language that we use.
Yeah, I think there was a couple like the book one and the idea of like books supposed to be great body armor, but then the other, and I should have pictures of these, but the extra judiciary one.
Extrajudicial, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the I can talk more about those too, for people who aren't looking at them. One of the things that I've done in my research for this project is watch a lot of YouTube videos by gun people, and which are fascinating. And there's been I don't know, at some point in media and in these YouTube videos, after a spate of school shootings, there was kind of more discussion about how kids can defend themselves from being shot if there's a shooter in their school, which I think is a horrifying thing that we might even need to consider teaching our children. So what kids were learning is in some of these lessons that were actually sort of like they would have a specialist come to school to like teach the kids how to hide properly and how to use the books in their backpack to defend themselves. And so, kids would be told to like put your backpack on your chest so that you're, if a bullet hits you, maybe the books will stop them. And then that was kind of reflected in some of these YouTube videos of like dudes, testing this out and seeing if a book really could stop a bullet. And so there are tons of videos of people doing this, shooting at books, specifically to see, how far a bullet will penetrate, and whether it's 2 books, whether a phone book does it, whether an encyclopedia does it, and I think all of that, hopefully, there's some aspect of the title that is pointing in that direction, in a way that the work maybe doesn't, unless you happen to be inside my brain. And yeah, so that's kind of my thought process about that.
These are really kind of dark and difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Do you get different reactions from people who are gun owners versus people who aren't?
Yeah, I think, so, I mean, I do think there are probably I would say gun owners and sort of gun, I think gun nuts is a bit pejorative, but people are really interested in that aspect of the world, I think are probably underrepresented in art audiences. But I do, particularly when I'm showing my work in Kansas, and even sometimes, I had a showing the work to a New York gallerist who, and I don't know, I maybe was talking to him in a particular way, and he said, I think I was talking to him about a photograph of an animal carcass, and said, this is really hard for a lot of people to look at, and a lot of people find it disturbing. And he said, why? and then, he told me like, oh, he's a really avid hunter. And, and so, sometimes people really surprise me. But I do think, I think sometimes for people who make who spend a lot of time in that world, it can feel like unwelcome criticism or unfair criticism, which I think is a natural human reaction. I think I would hope that some of those people are able to think more deeply about what maybe motivates their own use of guns or ownership of guns, why they feel it's important. The vast majority of gun owners don't hunt, actually, and are primarily report that they are using guns or keeping guns for self-protection, and to me that just represents this kind of fear of the world that is really hard for me to wrap my head around. It doesn't seem to jive with the reality that I exist in. And I think too, a lot of gun owners might see it primarily as a hobby, as something fun to do, and something that is without consequence. And, the statistics don't bear that out. There's a greater incidence of, people dying by gun suicide if you have a gun in the house. And, suicides are more likely to be successful if you shoot yourself rather than hang yourself. Kids are, unless you're real careful about how you're storing your guns, kids are getting shot all the time. And, there's just like so many things that can go wrong when you have a gun around you. And unless you're incredibly well trained with it, which I think most people aren't, then I would say it's a real risk.
Yeah, I think there was like statistics. So again, I think it's hard to study this, but I think there were statistics that about only maybe a third of gun owners are actually trained through like gun safety classes and
and when states
like
have sort of no requirements for licensing or anything like that, I think there are a lot of people who don't really know how to use their weapons, who in Kansas, they can walk around with them, they can bring them into the classroom. um, guns in public schools in Kansas, as I teach in a public university. I am forbidden by law to tell students that they cannot bring guns into the classroom, even though I have flammable and explosive chemicals in my photo lab, which is, I think a real sign of how irrational these laws are.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about within this series In Range, you have a new, I don't know, like I'd call it like maybe a sub-series of photographs of these album covers. If you could talk a little bit more about those.
Yeah, so this past summer, I usually make one trip per year to photograph these, which is kind of all I can fit into my schedule. But so on my trip this year, I found really dispersed over several sort of little pockets of shooting range, covering maybe about a mile. I found vinyl albums, and they were all sort of in the same condition and in from the same era. So I think they probably came from the same person. And I maybe found 20 albums or so, all from sort of the 70s. And some of them had been shot and some of them hadn't. And with maybe one or two exceptions, work by white men had not been shot, and work by women, Black people, Jews, gay people, and sort of other controversial work. So War of the Worlds was one of the albums that I found, although a kind of interesting version of it. But so things that had maybe been culturally difficult at the time they were produced. Those were the ones that have been sort of shot and blasted away at. And I can't get into the head of whoever was shooting them. It's possible that was complete coincidence, but I think it reflects the way that people kind of fitting into these categories actually exist in America. There's always some kind of threat related to their identity. And I did, there were some things that I knew. There's a Hair album, and I knew that Hair the musical, when it was first being performed, there were lots of protests about it because it, I can't remember all the things. There's maybe like an interracial couple or like, I don't know, a protest scene where they desecrated the American flag, something like that. What I didn't know kind of before doing a little research is that, there were actually violent attacks on the cast. There was a bombing attempt, and there was an arson at a hotel where the cast's family were staying, that actually killed two of the cast members' families. And so, I think anybody who puts themselves out into the public eye is always, risking being targeted for, kind of their aspects of their identity. And, I think unfortunately a lot of that has been, targeted toward these more minority groups and people who are maybe seen to threaten sort of the white majority in the country, or sort of male dominance. And I think that's been with us for a long time, and this reaction against culture, cultural production in particular, music and art, there's always been sort of violent backlash to work that is seen to be threatening, ideas that are seen to be threatening, identities that are seen to be threatening. I think that to me that's kind of what that work is all about. And it does kind of form its own sort of discrete set within the broader project. And I hope that it sort of, for me, it was a way to talk about a lot of different kinds of people that usually are a little bit hard to get into the work.
I didn't know some of that history of the Hair musical. That's really interesting. I think that adds a whole nother level to kind of some of the explorations that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those are all the questions that I have for you. Thank you for sharing your work with us. Did you have any other comments or thoughts before we wrap up?
I'll tell you one fun fact that I forgot to mention at the beginning. Dick Cheney lives just a couple of miles down the road from this particular site, which I think is, the first time I drove past, well, I don't know if he actively lives there. He has a ranch there. And there was a big sign that said Cheney that I found kind of early on while I was working on this. And I thought that can't be Dick Cheney. And then I did a little bit of research and I was like, oh, that is, Cheney as in Dick Cheney. And I think that it really, it kind of as an emblem of, why maybe this particular spot has worked so well for this project. Wyoming has some of the highest gun ownership rates in the whole country. And this is like kind of in the heart of Wyoming, in this sort of deep libertarian red heart of Wyoming. And I think that's why this particular spot has kind of worked out so well for the project. I've found lots of other little shooting ranges, but nothing that's quite so large. And I can go spend 2 weeks there and have new things to photograph every day.
Awesome.
So I think that's it. Thank you so much for hosting the show, for helping me put it up. I think that's that.
Oh, thank you. That was great. I encourage everyone to come in. We're open Wednesday through Saturday or Sunday from 11 to 5. And again, Jennifer Ray's work in range will be up through January 3rd. So, all right. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
All right. Thanks, Gretchen.